Surah 50. The basis of this surah is fairly late Meccan. It begins by rebuting an objection to the resurrection, verse 1 through 5, as proof of the doctrine Allah's power is set forth in verse 6 through 11 by the revision of adaptation of an earlier signed passage. The list of former peoples destroyed for unbelief, 12 and 13, if it belongs to the composition, is loosely introduced, for it enforces a temporal punishment rather than an eschatological one. Verse 14 is appropriate to the resurrection, but connects better with 37 than with its present sequel. Verses 15 to 34 were probably a later development of the resurrection theme. The stress is not upon the coming of the last day, but upon death of what follows after it. This is late Meccan or very early Medinan. Verses 28, 27, 26. Still later, probably overriding 22 to 25, but 22, 25 is there. Anyways, verse 35 and 36 are out of connection. They might have some relation to 12 and 13, but the presence is more probably due to 32 to 34, having been written on the back of them as a later addition to the preceding passage. The conclusion, 37 to 45, is almost certainly not a continuous composition. If it followed verse 14, it must have been of a still earlier passage. It is impossible to unravel this with certainty. You know, pretty much every chapter, it's almost impossible to explain how this could be an edit, is basically what's being said. But some has been evidently made on the times of prayer at the end of verse 38. Verse 43 to 45 show the presence of an older rhyme fairly clearly and would connect to the whole better with 38 than with 42. Are they just looking at the end rhymes here? So Surat Qaf, chapter Q, objections of the unbelievers, late Meccan Qur'an period. It's all the Qur'an period. That's a weird thing to say. Verse 6 through 11, God's power and bounty, an earlier sign passage, referring to the resurrection. 12 and 13, former unbelievers. 14, Allah's power, Allah being the singular and definitive word for God. His knowledge of man later, 15 through 18. And so, okay, where's the first note? The earth takes away. How much of the body molders away in the grave? That's fair enough of an interpretation. The servant disposed, you know, the human, whether it wants to be or not, it's subservient to certain natural laws. A provision for the servant from the grave. Okay, so the coming forth from the grave, I skipped. No, I didn't. Okay, so the man from the grave, and like 25, 40 Arras. Who are they? It's generally thought maybe even the Russians. Some people think it's the Russians or something. The Midian, the people of Midian, people of the Grove, you know, 26, 176. And the jugular vein, the verse often interpreted mystically, but the point is Allah's knowledge of man rather than man's union with Allah. So God's closer than ourselves, but that doesn't mean that God isn't inside and outside and around everything in between, but not union as in God is one with us, with matter anywhere, but you know, God's omnipresent is one of the things that comes through. 44, 36, you know, the people of Tuba. And 19 through 28, the judgment, the reward of the pious, 29 to 34. This is what I have ready, the record of man's deeds kept by these observing angels. So God never lets a witness separate from ourselves. There's some witnesses, some light beings that might refuse to be present with us, but it doesn't mean all the light beings go away when we have a graven image or whatever the thing is that is deterring of that. Not the one who's wrong with the servants, the humans, the devout, mindful of God's commands, entering in peace with the greeting peace, also related to the wholeness and all that. The two being met, the angel of death meeting the angel who's attended the life. Well, yeah, life and death meeting and all the beings associated with it, right?
Partially explained or explained in a different way by the Vishnu Dattas and the Yamadattas
in the Hindu myths, but former peoples destroyed for unbelief, 35, 36. Encouragement for the prophet. Perhaps straight to verse 14, 37 to 45. Okay. Some people want hastened from the grave, but we're going to be hastened at the right time, right? And the backs are the ends of the prostration. It's a peculiar phrase, and the structure of the verse is peculiar. As it said, the Qur'an is unique. Looks at adbar or idbar, withdrawal, and it's been the original rhyme of 38, rhyming with ayam, days, and 37, and the rest of 39, and the rhyme phrase of verse 37 and 38 being, but the passage they would say would continue with 43a and 44. There's no A, B, C, and any of that. The people searching and they want a refuge. But some people, like all these prophecies about these people saying what's to come, you dig holes in the earth. And these people with their underground things, maybe just like some of the people in the past who tried to dig cave systems and stuff. Those peoples eventually went extinct anyway. Same thing with yeah, that's quite the warning right there. Surah 51, the surah begins with a Meccan passage consisting of a series of asseverations, probably referring to the winds bringing up a rainstorm, and ending with a statement of the approach of judgment. This latter is of a rhyme and sometimes very effectively happens in such passages, and probably consisted of one verse, 5 and 6, being alternatives. Well, not everything is stated as quickly as possible, but as meaningly and as effective as possible, perhaps. Verse 7 through 9 have again a different rhyme. If they contain reference to the conflicting statements of previous monotheists, they will be Medinan. But this is by no means certain. The rest of the surah rhymes in een and un, but that final form of it is Medinan, and that's clear enough. But it's been built up at various times, and the bulk of it probably Meccan or very early Medinan. Whether the conjecturers mentioned in verse 10 are polytheists, are people of the book who satiated others with the law, and their worship is not quite clear, but the phrase day of judgment implies a very early date. Well, not quite, because some things are throughout, just like religious freedom, right up to the end, right? But towards the beginning, where he had no authority in society, whether or not he was going to, whatever. But but we're warned, just like in what's said of Buddhism and Confucianism and some other stuff. There's this postulating stuff and not having the knowledge. It's a dangerous game you play, whether on intellectual or spiritual grounds. The conjecturers. It's not the same thing as theorizing. Theorizing, you're actually going based on the evidence. But anyways, Verses 15 to 19 probably date from the same time, and the prominence of night prayers also implies an early date. As in 20 to 22, we probably have a still earlier sign passage worked over, as in 47 to 51, which may have at one time followed. These latter verses were perhaps displaced by the reference to unbelieving peoples. This is at first included only the stories of Abraham and Moses, followed by 52 to 55. Then 41 to 46, 46 probably an afterthought, were inserted on the back of 47 to 51, referring to the other unbelieving peoples. At the same time, verse 36 may have been added to the story of Abraham, and at the surah closed with a reference to the Medinan opponents of Muhammad, verse 59 and 60 on the back of 56 to 58. Surat Ad-Dariyat, chapter of those that scatter, the coming of the judgment, fairly early Meccan, first 6 verses. Some must be in error, 7 through 9. Well, if there's differing opinions, right? And some are involved in lies. So not all errors are lies, but literally whoever is involved in lies. Result in hesitation and doubt, late Meccan, 10 through 14. And then we talk about the conjectures, like in Surah 6, 8, 116, 149, 10, 67, and 43, 19. The deep waters, literally a flood of confusion, but we can refer to that opening chapter of Genesis in a way, can't we? Is it the opening chapter? Is it chapter 2? But I've talked about this in the some of the programs on Gnosticism, but and in heaven is your provision, usually interpreted as meaning the rain is a source of food. This also refers to the early basis of the passage. And what we're going to find some later stuff, right? And I don't mean the story of Abraham 24 to 37 here. I mean, which is Medina. Verse 36 is thought to be later than the rest of the passage. I mean, like the Quran talks about iron being set down. So there's some minerals and stuff in this world that are, not produced in this solar system, and otherwise actually continue the Earth continuing to evolve, you could say. Moses at the same time, 38 to 40. And so Moses is supplied a sign. And with this court, a pillar that supports. The angels don't eat, which makes Abraham suspicious. And we have some more signs and mention of unbelieving people, verse 41 to 51. And we have unbelievers to be left in unbelief, same time as 38 to 40, 52 to 55. Allah is not dependent on his creatures. 56 to 58. Well, we have the purpose of life, why, and a response is a more thorough way to look at that, I guess. Opponents will suffer the same fate as former unbelievers, Medinan. So yeah, don't think that, oh, well, we're a new generation. So just like this whole new age thing, it's like, well, it's the same stuff, whether they're right or wrong and the particular thing, it's the same type of thing that's always gone on. This nonsense that they're so advanced now, or latter-day prophets and of the Baptists and the charismatics and stuff, and are the Pope being an up-to-date authority or something. It's, are some incarnated series of lamas or that they claim. And falling out of construction, what's the verse? The people of Noah? Well, no, well, that's totally helpless, because if Noah's thing was a flood that caused the Black Sea and made the Red Sea bigger and stuff like this, this is, yeah, that totally fits that if you think of it like that. If you think of it as an entire worldwide flood thing, that there wasn't the overflow talked about in the Quran and stuff like this, then maybe it doesn't, it's not as understandable. But Surah 52, the surah shows signs of various connections. The rhyme varies, as in 51. The introduction of 1 to 10 is composite, but The relative dates of the two strands is a little doubtful. Most probably, however, verse 4 through 8 is a very early piece, which with 1 to 3 and 4 to 6 and 9 to 10, when the eschatological punishment has taken the place of the threat of the special punishment under the influence of monotheistic religion, whether the original of 11 through 28 was contemporary with 9 to 10 is doubtful. It is more probably later and even later than the original of 29, which looks more nearly contemporaneous with the revision of the introduction. In any case, both of these portions themselves have been later revised in 11 through 16, 13, 16 are later introductions, 17 to 28, 18, 19 are probably also later. 21 is certainly an addition, probably at a later date even than 18 and 19. 25, 28 are doubtful, but I should be inclined to regard them as not contemporary with the original verses. Verse 29 are of such a form that additions may have been made without any signs being left, and we cannot be sure that 29 to 38, 41, 44, 45 are contemporary, though they probably are. Verse 39 and 40 break the connection and are later. 42 and 43 are pretty certainly later. Also 46, while 47 is almost certainly Medinan and not quite early. The original of the passage seems fairly certainly Meccan, and the date of 48, 49 is not certain, but it seems to go best with the original of 29. It may have been modified to suit the times of prayer at some later stage. Surat At-Tur, chapter of the Mount, punishment surely coming. What? Oh, okay. They 4, 5, 6 is put on the left side. It's difficult to read because they're switching about and whatnot. But okay, we have how many verses? I guess that is the entirety of that. So the praise of thy Lord when you arise in prayer. And verse 47, probably a veiled threat against the Jews of Medina, all those who do not know. Oh, but it doesn't say all of them. See, it says most of whatever, but again, it's beyond some response to the Christians or the Jews. It's just, that's the prominent community that maybe we might think about that, and people and they're ladder to listen, to the heavenly council. Psychological assent is not the same thing as spiritual assent. I mean, you can open yourself up psychologically to whatever, but yeah, that's not the same thing. Without anything, now all this mention of the Jews in the commentary is making me think of Kabbalah and Gnosticism and stuff like that. But anyways, without anything, yeah, the discourse like it. Where is the discourse like it? And the IUD, we have no purpose, but there's always this challenge, not always this challenge, but you know what I mean? From towards the end of the Quran, the beginning of the Quran, there's always this challenge. Hey, where's your scripture like this, right? And their understandings of, warning them about their understandings that give them control and that sort of stuff, because it's not about control. The Kaaba is the house frequented, the roof upraised, as in the sky, because the sky operates as a roof from the rest of the heavens. There's verses that indicate that the skies protect us, and there are 7 skies, but we have the reference to the heavens too, as a broader thing, and the lowest with the stars. But anyways, you got the Mount Sinai, because we're connecting it to the Moses thing, right? The revelation of the hands of previous monotheists given to Moses at Sinai. Well, that would be a mount. But didn't Jesus kind of go up on a mountain and the devil came to him and according to the Bible and said, hey, Jesus, the Messiah, part of that story, and said, hey, I'll give you all these kingdoms, and, tempted him various ways. And so the averter the beginning of it, but people, they say 7 and 8 are out of the rhyme, but see, the punishment is about to fall, and then you see some context, right? But, so thematically, it brings you out of it, and then you're of the passage. You know what I mean? It brings you out to have an effect, but it continues you within the passage. But the mountains go on their travels. They've removed, we find in this earth, some of the lowest points become some of the highest, and some of the highest become some of the lowest, and it just happens over time. The mountain, the groups of mountains actually do move, and I don't mean earthquakes. Like, what Mount St. not Mount St. Helens, but Yellowstone, hasn't Yellowstone moved over billions of years across different states and stuff like this? So yeah, there's that. And so the garden, they drink their special drink in the garden. They have the wine, and they don't have any, there's no vanity in the hereafter. But in this world, there's anxiety about the coming judgment, other issues that people will have. Surah 53, verses 1 to 18, describe 2 visions, which Muhammad claims to have seen. One would expect these to have occurred and been described in justification of his activity fairly earlier in his career as a religious reformer. No, actually, rather late, actually, comparatively. Again, it helps to look at the actual narrations themselves of these chapters and stuff like this. It's still discernible that it was Allah that he thought he had seen. Well, not quite, because he's saying, he wasn't, but anyways, Surah 6, 103 is not conflicted in any of the other verses. So that tells you something. It is, but there being objections to this, verse 11 and 12, the impression of visual manifestation. Well, if there are objections, he did it on the spot, because it's very well narrated that he came out, he recited this chapter, some people yelled out in the middle, and at the end, people prostrated. People who were polytheist, monotheist, people who considered themselves Muslim, those who weren't, people fell down prostrating. It was anyways, both visions, and particularly the second, are sometimes associated with the night journey, but this weakens their force. Well, you could say some things are broader, but it's however possible that 15 and 18 were to give that impression. If the recognition of the pagan deities as intercessors, which tradition associates with verse 19, is historical, as is probable, because again, it's something that it's narrated outside that incident, that is what people would say on the pilgrimage. So the polytheists calling that out, but they don't fit in with the Qur'an. They don't fit in linguistically, thematically, before and after it conflicts with it. A lot of people, I think, if that one incident alone, if Muhammad had been the one saying it rather than the people, it, could have undid the whole thing, and we might never have heard of Islam. Even I might never have heard of Islam if that was the case. The passage seems to be sometime later than the immigration to Abyssinia, and verse 21 must still be later, unless we assume that the discarded verses were meant ironically and were misunderstood by the Meccans. Verse 26 seems to imply that in the original passage there was some such reference to intercession as appears in the discarded verses which tradition has preserved. Verse 23 is clearly an insertion. 27, a later modification. Verse 26 were different in style from the rest of the surah and are evidently like 23, a later edition. Verse 34, agree with style with an early portion, though there is apparently no apparent connection in the subject that consists largely of summary points in which Muhammad's teaching agrees with that of previous revelation. If the passage should be early, verse 38 probably did not belong to it originally, and verse 53 is evidently an afterthought. Well, you need different sorts of thoughts on issue. Verse 56, he doesn't make, he doesn't consider good for that place, but compared to the refrain in Surah 54. Okay, yeah, maybe you can. I don't usually make that connection that 53 and 54 can possibly be matched sound-wise. Because I haven't experienced everything you could say about this stuff, so that's 57 and 58 might join to what precedes, but the rhyme in 58 is not quite the same. Verses 58, verses 59 to 62 have quite a different rhyme, and evidently, well, he thinks they don't belong to the surah, despite the historical proof that it does. But the presence of these is probably due to their having been used for the addition of 33 to 27 to 32, which is written on the back of 34 to 56. For fuller discussion, see the Muslim World, 24, page 145. If people were writing on the scraps, it didn't matter which verses they were, other than it's the next, right? And so everything would have been on the back of other portions. So it's a weird and pointless comment if there was any truth to it. But Muhammad's visions, fairly early Meccan, 11 and 12, thought to be later. Although but 1 through 18. So the comrade, Muhammad, it's nothing but a suggestion suggested. The prophet speaking her message, period. So when a prophet of God speaks on religious authority, it's not their own will. We find this in the Bible. Jesus is not the inventor of his own doctrine. Now, when people say, well, I like this food versus that food, that's different. You don't have to get fanatical about that. But you can. But if Muhammad said something spiritual, he said, this is the revelation. This is, he's giving, there's some sort of religious saying, some right and wrong, that sort of stuff. Yeah, it's not his own inclination. Forceful, he stood right. So either bodily or an intellect, according to the two explanations, usually take Gabriel verse 58 of 51, where similar epithets are applied to Allah. Okay, but no, anyways, the thing is that there wasn't something wrong going on with his body. It wasn't some fever dream or something. It wasn't, he wasn't having some emotional fit or some intellectual confusion or something at the time. It was just everything was clear in the material, in the bodily, mental worlds, and then he had this spiritual experience. That's what's going on. Suggested the servant, what was suggested, Muhammad, God's servant, and the garden of the abode, some dwelling place near Mecca, but the verse is taken to refer to the heavenly places. Like I posted a video at the end of last Ramadan, and I hinted at both the physical heaven and the metaphorical spiritual heaven in what I included on that door. But the whole vision is often taken so it robs it of its force. Well, no, not saying that. The force is still very strong, whether you consider the one or the other, but it's not a shock per se. It's, anyways, the false deities, the Nakala, fairly late Meccan, 19 through 26, and So verse 8, according to tradition, this is followed when delivered by 2 verses. These are swains exalted, whose intercession is to be hoped for which the time being the Meccans called out, and it led to the return of some of those who emigrated to Abyssinia. It is very improbable that such a story would have been invented. Well, no, that's not actually the story. The story is that some of the Meccans called out, and no one early on ever said that, that Muhammad had said stuff that wasn't in the Quran as part of the Quran. This is all stuff centuries later. And that particularly was, like 4 or 5 centuries later, a Jewish person wrote down this fiction, and everybody knew it was a fiction, after his family, all his family and friends converted to Islam, and he was, upset about the thing. But he saw the greatest signs of his Lord. So that kind of refutes kind of what would be added with that, right? Because 19 and 20, then some would say after, those people would say after 20, because you have the female, you have goddess, the mighty she, actually related to Shamyaza, right? Emanat, the fortune, Mani and God, but that's a similar thing. Mani and God would be like the male counterparts to mix with these, right? That passage in the Bible. And by God, I don't mean the English word God. I mean in Aramea, GD, which is weird to have that abbreviation consider. Anyways, so stinginess, that's what niggardliness means. That's nothing to do with color of skin or anything like that. 27 to, oh no, okay. 27 in with 26 and the ones before that. Stinginess, 34 to 43, 28 to 33 is angels aren't female. The hereafter. Some of the Jews have developed a doctrine about not believing in the hereafter, and they don't. Some of them are even trained to not want a hereafter. I'm not kidding about that. So told of the pages of Moses, probably the sheets or leaves of writing materials, the scrolls, that sort of thing. The Quran talks about scrolls because previous scriptures at the time were written on scrolls. And so the oldest manuscripts of a lot of the stuff we have in regard to the other spiritual communities is scroll stuff. And the sacrifice to Abraham thought he needed to sacrifice his son, Genesis 22, but the Quran doesn't say that God gave the command. Abraham saw a dream and assumed it would be from God, and he was commanded to do it. And God says, hey, don't do it. I love those who are righteous. So if he fulfilled the dream, the implication is that he wouldn't have been righteous, right? And God gave him a better substitute of something to do. There's no satisfactory explanation of the pages of Abraham, except that Abraham at some time would have had a scripture. But the phrase implies that the recognition of Abraham as a prophet, which is Medinan. And then we have to 58. Oh, well, and I guess to 62. So the portents of that which is near at hand, the portending day, it's a refrain we have in Surah 54. We have mention of death in 40, verse 18, because people have their doubt about the death to come. Oh, that's the portending day. What is the refrain that we have other places? Okay, I'm looking for 3. Oh, the doubt. of thy Lord dost thou cast out. So in Surah 54, we have mention of that. And where's the other one? One would expect a name derived from the Old Testament, Al Shaddai, which is Al, the power, and Shadi is the exorcism, the goat demon exorciser is a way to translate it. I'm going to leave that as is. But some think incorporated here. Cyrus played some part in the superstitions of the Arabs because down into Egypt, they thought Cyrus was the provider. And then we're hearing here that God was the provider of their so-called provider. And Samada only occurs in verse 61 and is sometimes said to refer to music or singing. Well, don't distract yourself from what you should do, but yeah, there's a lot of traditions about making every single moment of life count. So Surah 54. This surah may be read continuously, except at the end. The confusion there, however, shows, well, the confusion, this concept that the Qur'an's edited, however, shows that that it's not quite that simple. It contains, in fact, a mixture of ideas, the stories of former unbelievers, of which it largely consists, and forces the doctrine of a special calamity falling upon disobedient peoples, not the doctrine of a last day and judgment. The stories themselves show signs of different periods, though it is possibly be certain as to what is early and what is later. There are 2 refrains at the end of each, and perhaps 3 at the end of that of Noah. This would indicate that they have been repeated in different contexts. Well, the Samveda Rajaveda argument makes that part pretty clear of why different contexts and, maybe every single line in a scripture is not entirely unique from every other line or verse or something, but this would indicate that they have been repeated in different contexts. In introduction 3 and 4 would suit the earlier doctrine, possibly the second clause of verse 3 to be later insertion, its phraseology being suspiciously Medinan, verse 1 and 2, 5 to 8, enforce the resurrection and the near approach of the last day. The end of the surah contains at least 4 conclusions, the earliest perhaps 49 to 51, which would be appropriate to a series of stories enforcing the temporal punishment. Well, sometimes you face consequences here, right? Verse 52 to 53 hint at a coming judgment. 46 to 48, 54 to 55 are distinctly eschatological and belong to the same time as the adaptation of the introduction. Verse 44 and 45, with their military phraseology, are probably Medinan, and 43b probably belongs to the same time, hinting at Jewish self-assurance. With this exception, the surah is no doubt Meccan. Surat al-Qamar, chapter of the moon, the last day draws near, Meccan, verse 3 and 4 may be earlier than the others. The moon being split is one of the phenomena of the last day in the apocalyptic literature. Here it is said to have actually happened, and there was people as far as China that were recording at the same time, and people accepted Islam in China because they heard legends of the moon splitting the year that these people coming said that this was one of the signs that were shown. A partial eclipse of the moon may have given occasion for the assertion. You could say it's a reference to the Quraysh that had moons on their flag until they became Muslim. The suns and the moons and the stars on the flags weren't something that the early Muslim community had, because people put the names and ensigns of what they worshipped on the flags, and we left it blank, plain green, plain black, plain white, or maybe a couple things together, or a couple scraps hung up together or something, but that's a different issue. One bit of magic after another. They say that, oh, it's just something of going on with the spirits when they witness the signs in the heavens and all that. Former peoples destroyed for unbelief. enforcing the coming of the last day, people of Noah, 9 through 17, Odd, 18 through 22, the mood, 23 to 32. And so we see that repeated verse and repeated verse. The people of Lot, 33 to 40, ending with that repeated verse. Pharaoh, 41 and 42. Application of Muhammad's own people, 43, 44, 45. And let's just say continuation to 53. Oh, and 55. Okay. The Saqqar, like in Surah 74, verse 26. If the word is, well, everything in the Quran is Arabic, so, but it would mean burning heat, scorching, but perhaps borrowed. Well, Arabic, you can say Arabic didn't exist 2,000 years ago. So that's saying that everything in Arabic would be original. That just doesn't make sense. Especially since it was a place in the middle, there would have been something, even if there was a the Proto-Arabic Semitic tongues or something you could call, they would have mixed together, and they would have mixed with Persian and influences to the north, and some of the African, I say that because really some would say up by Turkey, and then Syria and Israel and stuff like this would be part of Africa in some divisions, usually thought to be in Asia, but anyways, the peoples referred to in previous parts of the chapter, unless it's Medina and addressed to the Jews, but again, the allies of the disbelievers, it's a broad thing that continues to be applicable. The Psalms, same word found in verse 52, where it evidently means the book of men's deeds, or is it the scrolls? The scrolls, okay, that's the word for psalm is a different word, so that's why I didn't understand where that was coming from. One who makes an enclosure for himself, the wall builder, the scrub, the broken stuff, the rubble. And we have, what's the front of it? Water to be shared, divided up to be used. And in passing, a calamity, a continuous calamity, a sign being left, the Ark of Noah, and that's made clear in other places too, but sometimes a phrase here and there, we kind of don't understand it so well. No matter how eloquent, something is, if we're not being warned, if we're not taking the summoning, it doesn't avail anything. But it's there because it's supposed to, right? And sufficient. Without the Quran, without the Quran, without the message of Muhammad, there's enough guidance for those, because of rumor and stuff about Islam, obviously. Don't take to the truths therein. We're just calling for making it easier. Surah 55, this surah is distinguished by having a refrain occurring first at verse 12, after that at intervals of 2 verses, and from 23 onwards at intervals of 1, except at 43 and 44, which should probably form only 1 verse. This refrain has the pronoun in the dual throughout the surah being understood as addressed to men and jinn. This address does not, however, occur specifically until verse 31. The preceding part of the surah recounts the benefits bestowed by the merciful. It seems to consist of early pieces brought together and bound up by the refrain, verse 7 and 8, or later, and probably 13 and 14. These may have been added at the same time as the refrain, when also the eschatological portions from 31 onwards. Interesting enough, 31 is the number of the repeated phrase, have been composed. The descriptions of the garden, however, have been added to at some later date or dates, while Hausen suggested that in these two more or less simple descriptions of the 2 gardens, we have a case of duplication due to varying recollections on the part of those from whom the compilers got the surah. This is possible, but the broken grammar at the end of both descriptions seems to me to imply rather that both passages belong to the surah and were similarly revised later. The frequent use of the plural gardens, the Qur'an, and the plural pronoun here in verse 56 and 70 suggests that Muhammad did think of the number of gardens, perhaps with the four rivers of the Garden of Eden, although that connection is not tied, but they're talking about the hereafter, not the worldly. Mentioned in Genesis, the surah as a whole seems to be Meccan. Surat Ar-Rahman, chapter of the merciful, Allah's bounties. And is that the entirety of the heading? Nope. After 30, starting with 33, we have punishment and presumption of ingratitude and reward of the pious, starting at 46. And okay, so the pronoun changes to the plural, but it was singular. 20, verse 56, and verse 54 has that talk about reclining, the green cushions, which kind of makes you think, why was Qadr called Qadr? So Qadr is the green one, so that could be that. And so the damsel's the thing changing. Well, it's a bit broader than that, but it's the purified, idealized, but well, ideal really, partners. But the humans that have earned their position in paradise are better than these beings that are meant to serve us in the hereafter. The kindness ties it back to verse 29, right? The garden is mentioned in the plural, but not the dual. We're talking about the two gardens, and the judgment seat. Okay, the judgment seat is the position. If you're God's position, where's the recline on the carpets? The people reclining and resting and whatnot, they're the people of the, that have won in the hereafter. And the two bosom companies, the jinn and the man, the jinn and the humans, they both had their choices and they didn't all make good decisions, and that led to difficulties, right? Rather than the other creatures, which just go along doing the right thing, right? And people will say, what about the predator animals and stuff? It's like, well, no, they're innocent for that. That's what they're supposed to be doing. It's all part of the cycle of nature. A flame and a smoke, the molten brass, and the meaning's uncertain. But we do see some of the stuff that happens in natural and war type disasters. So the smoke, and it could, whether it's natural or whatever. But then we're going to talk about sky splitting, reddening, sort of stuff going on, and whether that's some weapon or something like that. We're gonna are some blast from outer space, or some star having some sort of eruption or something that burns off the earth or something. Literally, that can happen. That's happened to other planets. I mean, they don't know if there was life on it, but you know what I mean. Well, not this solar system, but okay, going around the hot water drawing near, the boiling point. Verse 44 is with 43, but Imam Masood says it's said to have read, "This is Gehenna, which you twain counted false, and that you roast neither dying nor living going round." This looks 41 and 43b were later. Well, if they're saying there's a vowel mark or something, it gives that a little bit difference of meaning. But then again, if you look at the translations, you can say, well, it looks a little bit different here and here, but not contradictory, but you know. So like red hide, uncertain, read Warda, flowing down for Warda, Rosie, and see 2 Peter 3, verse 10. Okay. And Surah 26, that the first part of this surah is not a unity, is shown only by the varying rhymes. Well, that doesn't mean it's not a rhyme. You know, that's literally how songs work. So why can't that work with scripture? But the breaks in its sense at 24 and 34, you know, again, to have this effect pull at you, or at least that's what it does. Verse 24, 25 seem to link more with verse 12, and 34 to 39 are evidently in it referring to the haris, you know, the pure damsels is a way to say it. And no, it doesn't mean grapes, because some different language, some idiot tried to find stuff in the Quran that says, well, it could be a totally different meaning because these couple passages, like, even if it did mean grapes, it doesn't undo the Quran, right? And what else did he do that sort of thing with? When an addition was made, apparently belonged to the description of the felicity of those on the right. Verse 8 and 9 imply only 2 classes in the future life, but as the surah now stands, there are 3. The third class, sabiqun, those who go before, are those who have precedence. Is not, it's difficult to explain. Well, those who've, you know, their influence is carried on, then we come after, right? It's not, they are defined here as those brought near, a designation elsewhere in connection to the angels and also prophets, but nowhere clearly delimited. Well, the earlier part of Muhammad's community gets credit for just little small deeds, and it's like, you know, a great good life doesn't equal that, because their influence just, you know, that's what's being talked about in some other references. Another definition is given in Surah 9 at 101, where Sabiqun are said to be the first of the Muhajirin and the Ansar, and those who have followed them in well-doing. That, however, belongs to a not quite early Medinan date, while this passage, while probably Medinan, must be early. The Sabiqun were apparently a class whose exact significance had been forgotten, and that may be suggested that they were those followers of Muhammad who had died before Allah's intervention had appeared to vindicate them. Verse 10a, 12, 24, 25 may have been an answer to a question about them. Later, they were defined as those brought near by the introduction of verse 10b. There's no ABC, you know, 11, 13, 14, perhaps on the margin, but yeah, that's what they did with the Bible. So they're just assuming that the Bible process was all, this was in a margin, and later things, something gets taken or added in. No, there's no evidence of any of this ever happening with the Quran. But in order to give a description of this specially favored class in the future life, verses 15 to 23 were detached from the positions after 33 and used after verse 12 and 24, 25, being discarded as unsuitable. But how is it discarded if it remains in the passage where it was said to be? Earliest parts of the surah would therefore be verse 1 to 3, 8, 9, 26, 33, 15 to 23, 40 to 45, verse 46 to 56 seem a rather later addition to the description of the state of those on the left, and varying rhymes in the description of the state of those on the right may perhaps indicate that it too was built up at different stages. Verse 34 to 39 must have been added before the change in the order of the verse was made. These parts may be Meccan, but the use of the phrase Jannat an-Na'im in verse 12 is suspiciously Medinan, and the constitution of the third class, those brought near, must still be later. Verse 4 to 7 in the introduction must also belong to the later time. The third class is referred to in the passage at the end of the surah, 74 to 96, which bears other marks of being early Medinan. The intervening passage, 57 to 73, though it might be connected with what precedes, really differs in subject from the rest of the surah, being an arrangement for Allah's power. It ends the same way as verses 74 to 96, and is practically the same length, and probably a Meccan piece on the back of which 74 to 96 have been written. Well, whether the thing is the size of a Post-it or a whole sheet or whatever, whether it's written on the back or not has nothing to do with anything. Surat al-Waqiyah, chapter of the event, the coming of the judgment, Meccan, possibly Medinan parts, first 9 verses, the felicity of the faithful, early Medinan, but 15 to 23 earlier, so 10 to 23, and set with jewels is woven with gold. You know, gold and jewels. Remember that stuff in the Bible about you weave in the, you weave in the metal work, and you have all those stones and stuff with it. It's like in the hereafter, we're each going to get our set of that, right? 3 classes described as follows. There's no false speaker. Yeah, the hereafter, we're going to drop that. Mark Twain, which book did Mark Twain talk about the guy in heaven? Captain Stormfield. The second class of the faithful, same time as verse 1 to 3, 8 and 9, 26 to 33. Oh, okay, so the bent down with fruit, so thornless. Acacias, bananas, fruit spikes. I don't know, I guess mangoes could be of that. And 15 to 23 are thought to have somehow changed places. I don't know why they think that. 34 to 39, the special production, the Horis of verse 23. So in the hereafter, there's stuff that's just for us, fresh for us. That's the point. And the previous chapter talked about them as unopened, so they're virginal, as far as anybody else. The hint word only occurring in verse 45. I don't know if this is the right one, but the great refusal, it's usually connected with the failure to perform an oath. So that's verse 40 to 45, the pains of the unfaithful, and 46 to 56. And then we have this sublimity of the Qur'an and the result of man's attitude towards it. 74 to 84, Allah's power. 57 to 73 to 63. To 73. The other one is 74 to 96. See, they make it difficult with their page formatting. The Zaqqum, see also 3760. Zaqqum is said to have been the name of a tree with bitter fruit growing in the Hejaz. The word occurs in Syriac, meaning hog bean, which would suit the context here. One of the things about that is very interesting, because it's something, it's kind of related to the term for like cold, because it's stifling. It makes it difficult to swallow or breathe or whatever. That's the thing. The semen, well, the sexual fluid, the thing emitted in desire. The original interpretation of the heavenly original of the Quran might refer to the scriptures, but the scriptures in general, the treasured book, touched only by the purified, you know. So in context, in physically, you don't touch the scripture unless you have ablutions, if at all possible. But you also approach it with a purity of mind and soul. And if you don't have that purity, then you're just, whether you physically go through the motions or mentally go through the motions, you're not going to get some things. And the soul leaves the body while the bystanders are challenged to send it back if they are dependent of God. You know, that thing about it when it coming to the windpipe. Increasing, as in sowing, planting. Wondering. A lot of that planting metaphor in religious scriptures. But remember, it used to be there were planting cults and animal cults and stuff like this. And we're not divorcing from those issues. We're just having them in monotheism. The death. Those brought near the dying people. Where's the reference? The truth of certainty. Say, so when it's all over, you have that truth of certainty, which explains the end of Surah 15. And some people wonder, you know, there's speculations they say to each other. And I guess here's the last one I'm going to comment about in this video and divide it into a further video. Surah 57, a series of passages fairly early Medinan date forming the basis of this surah, verse 1 to 6, 7 through 12, part 13, 15, 16, and originally of 17, 18, 19, 21, 25, 28, 29. These passages extol Allah and appeal for belief, and not for contributions in support of projects, nor quite to the mind of the Prophet's followers, the war with Mecca. If we take these verses as being all of one date, an intermediate stage in his gradual estrangement from the people of the book is indicated by verse 18, 21, 29, in which belief in the former messengers is indicated by 18, 21, 29. Belief in former messengers as well as himself is still being inculcated. Well, it's never dropped. You know, you build up with beliefs and practices. You don't say, oh, well, you know, this is for this time, and that dispensationalism, even within your own life, is silly, right? When it reaches that extent. Chapter 2, verse 130 is of the same sort. The expansions probably belong to a date not too long after the Battle of Uhud. If the reference of verse 22 to 24, the loss at Uhud and the battle and the spoil of Beni Nadir were certain, the time would be fixed fairly closely, but the words are too vague for certainty. Still later seem to have been made with 10 and 27. The word Fath in verse 10 may have various meanings, and the clause itself is not free from difficulty. It seems to refer to a victory already won, but it may refer to coming success, and would then fit into verse 10 as an incentive to early giving. The length of the verse, however, argues for an addition having been made. Also in verse 27, the modification in the approval of monasticism is probably late, 9:31 to 34. Surat al-Hadid, chapter of iron. The glory of Allah, early Medinan, 6 verses. The outward and the inward. This may be paraphrased, manifest in all things, present in and through all things. Well, it reaches that same area of meaning. Comes down from the heaven, such as rain, but we're talking about the Revelation 2 specifically here. And the successors to, stewards of, wealth being regarded as really belonging to Allah. Otherwise, the reference may be to what is taken as booty from others. The logicality of the phrase is possibly due to the necessary of a rhyme, and partly to the believers being the designation for Muhammad's followers. How is it to say, he took your covenant, you know, if you're believers, he's already taken your he's taken your promise. There's nothing illogical about that. before you utter it. Just like you have reference to even other beings, right? That they know that somebody is turned over to the dark side or whatever, and then they come to the person and start with them before they perform their big ritual pact or whatever they think they need to do in their he, the servant that receives the messages, so he may bring you from darkness into light. So the Chaitanya thing, but in the human sense, which is confused with that guy, 500 years ago? He was a servant of Chaitanya as a lesser Chaitanya, you could say. So a guru, you could say Muhammad is guru. And there's this chapter deals with the hermit card lesson if you're going to talk about the tarot and all that. You got the clearing up, C32 verse 29. The usual interpretation is the conquest of Mecca is referred to, which is probably right, but the victory of Badr. And but there is clearing up of issues and such. We of course refer to the future reward as the better part, and the male and female, like 11 and 12, are thought to be part of the earlier part of the chapter. The fate of the hypocrites, 13 to 14, fairly early Medinan. The believers remonstrated with, early Medinan, 15 through 17. And on its side arising, confirmed, you could say, by turning to Matthew 25, verse 1 to 13. So the outside of it and the front of it, and turning back, they're trying to seek their light. And the dogmas that deluded them, the conservative conclusions, overstepping a lot of them. Relate yourself to Surah 4, verse 140. And the male and female, the deluder is Satan. And then we have the reference to the male and female, those who believe. So the community working together. And we have the advantages of belief, early Medinan, verse 20, maybe later, but 18 through 21. The bad and good fortune alike predestined. After Uhud, the expulsion of Bani Nadir, 22 to 24. Allah's bounty, early Medinan, 25. Okay, and verse 20 is probably related to 21. 20 and 21 work together, so there's no replacement or substitution going on. So what sense does that make? The drawing up, like mentioned in Surah 39, 8-22, the former messengers and their followers later, with in 27, but 26 to 29. So Abraham, it doesn't mention Moses, but does this imply that there was a break for the Jews at the time this was learned? Or was this really just, there's some order to the numbers of stuff in the Quran? That alone would explain maybe there's some stuff going on, but it's just, Noah and Abraham seem more primal of leaders, in a way. Monasticism, something invented, because in Islam, we are to get married. We don't fast every day. In Ramadan we do, but when we're fulfilling an oath or whatever, but otherwise we don't fast every day. If we don't shun marriage. We have spouses. We, engage in that sort of thing. The people of the book may not know that they have no power over. Okay, so not in the text is superfluous, but no, they may know. No, they may not know that. Because you convince, even with the scripture right in front of you, you can convince yourself that, that you've gained some sort of power that's independent or something.